is a pretty reasonable assumption most people have about flying animals, and that is that at some point they simply get too big to fly. And honestly, you're not wrong for thinking that. The largest flying bird alive today is the wandering albatross, which tops out at a wingspan of around 3.7 meters or about 12 feet and a weight of roughly 12 kilograms or 26 pounds. And even that thing honestly looks like it has no business being in the air. Go much bigger than that and the physics just seem to stop cooperating, except that 68 million years ago, something was routinely flying over what is now the city of Los Angeles that had a wingspan of around 10 to 11 meters, that is 33 to 36 feet, weighed up to 250 kilograms or 550 pounds, and stood as tall as a giraffe when it touched the ground. It was not a bird. It wasn't even a dinosaur. It was a pterosaur called Quetzalcoatlus northropi, and it holds the title of the largest thing that has ever left the ground under its own power in the entire history of life on this planet. And the ground it was hunting over 68 million years ago is the same ground you're standing on right now. Now, before we get into just how insane this animal actually was, it helps to understand what Los Angeles even looked like back then, because it was not the LA, in basically any sense. 68 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous, the geography of North America was dramatically different from what it is today. The Rocky Mountains were still being actively pushed upward by tectonic forces, which meant the interior of the continent was far lower than it is now. Low enough, in fact, to be flooded by a shallow inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway, a body of water that basically cut North America in half for about 34 million years, splitting it into two island landmasses. The western one, which is where modern California sits, is what geologists call Laramidia, and it was essentially a long coastal strip running from what is now Alaska all the way down through Mexico. The area that would eventually become the LA Basin sat on the southern end of this strip, right along the warm Pacific coast, with a flat subtropical lowland stretching inland and dense fern vegetation covering most of the ground. The Santa Monica Mountains did not exist yet, neither did the San Andreas Fault in its current form. If you could somehow hover above the area where downtown Los Angeles is today and look around, you would not recognize a single thing about it. What you would see, though, if you looked up at the right moment, was Quetzalcoatlus. So let's actually talk about this animal, because the wingspan alone undersells it. Quetzalcoatlus belonged to a group of pterosaurs called Ajdarchids, which were the giant long-necked members of the pterosaur family and were the last and largest pterosaurs to ever exist. The wingspan of around 10 to 11 meters is the number that gets thrown around the most, and for good reason, because for reference, a Cessna 172, which is the single-engine plane that the majority of student pilots learn to fly on, has a wingspan of about 11 meters. So you are looking at a living creature the size of a small aircraft. However, despite that wingspan, the animal was relatively light for its size, coming in somewhere between 200 and 250 kilograms or 440 to 550 pounds, which sounds like a lot until you realize it is genuinely not that much for something that big and that low weight relative to size as the entire reason it could fly at all. Pterosaurs had hollow bones similar to birds, but taken even further, and Quetzalcoatlus was essentially a massive skeleton wrapped around an enormous set of wings with as little mass as evolution could get away with. And then there is the neck. The wingspan is shocking, but the neck is the thing that really gets you once you see a reconstruction of this animal. Quetzalcoatlus had a neck estimated at somewhere between 1.5 and 3 meters long, or roughly 5 to 10 feet. And attached to that neck was a skull that was itself around 2.5 meters or about 8 feet from base to tip, with a long toothless beak that narrowed to a sharp point at the end. When this animal was standing on the ground on all four limbs, folding its wings up like a pair of enormous arms, it would have reached a height of around 5 to 6 meters or 18 feet. That is the height of a giraffe, except this one had wings wider than your living room and a beak the length of a surfboard. Now, for a long time, scientists assumed that something this size must have been primarily a scavenger, basically a giant vulture that soared over the landscape looking for carcasses to pick apart with that long beak, and that made intuitive sense. The problem is that the anatomy does not really support it. More recent studies on Ajdarchid biomechanics and the environments they lived in have pushed back on the scavenger idea pretty firmly, and the current leading hypothesis is actually that Quetzalcoatlus was a stalking predator. It likely moved through open lowlands lowlands and coastal flats on foot, using that long neck and beak to snatch up small dinosaurs, lizards, mammals, and whatever else it could find. Similar to how a modern stork or marabou hunts today, but scaled up to a genuinely absurd degree. And if something startled it or it wanted to cover ground quickly, it would simply open those 11-meter wings, take a running leap, and disappear into the sky, which, to be fair, would have been quite a sight. The flying part is actually worth spending a moment on because it was no small engineering feat. Getting something that heavy off the ground requires a very specific launch technique, and research suggests that Quetzalcoatlus used what is called a quadrupedal launch, basically planting all 4 limbs and vaulting itself into the air using the enormous muscles at the base of its wings, getting airborne in a single explosive jump rather than running along the ground like an airplane. Once it was up, it was apparently extraordinarily efficient, capable of long-distance soaring flights on thermal columns rising off the warm Laramidian lowlands, riding them the way an albatross rides ocean winds, barely flapping at all. Estimates put its cruising speed at somewhere around 100 to 130 kilometers per hour, or about 60 to 80 miles per hour, and it could likely sustain flight for days at a time, covering thousands of kilometers across the late Cretaceous landscape without landing. That landscape, by the way, kept changing under its wings for millions of years. The late Cretaceous was not a single snapshot in time. The western interior seaway was constantly shifting, sometimes pushing further west toward what is now California, sometimes retreating. The climate was warm and relatively stable by modern standards, with no permanent polar ice caps and average global temperatures significantly higher than today, which is part of why the thermal columns that something like Quetzalcoatlus depended on for flight would have been plentiful and reliable over the coastal plains of Laramidia. It was, in a strange way, genuinely good conditions to be a giant flying reptile. Things were going extremely well for Quetzalcoatlus and its relatives right up until approximately 66 million years ago, when an asteroid roughly 10 to 15 kilometers wide hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and ended the Mesozoic era in what is probably the least subtle geological event in Earth's history. The impact winter that followed collapsed the food chains that a 250-kilogram stalking predator depended on, and Quetzalcoatlus, along with every other large pterosaur, was gone within a geologically short period of time. The skies over the ground that would become Los Angeles went quiet in a way they hadn't been in hundreds of millions of years. No fossils of Quetzalcoatlus have ever been found in California specifically, with the best known specimens coming out of Big Bend, Texas. But the late Cretaceous coastal lowlands of Laramidia were a continuous environment stretching across the entire American Southwest, and there is no real ecological reason why this animal, with its enormous range and soaring flight capabilities, would not have been a regular presence over the ground now occupied by the city of Los Angeles. The habitat was exactly right. The prey was there, the thermals were there,